This is part 2 of the video slideshow for lecture 5, and in this video we're going to be covering memo use and a little bit about document design. So first of all, you may be wondering why in the 21st century we might use a memo, and it's certainly true that memos are used less frequently than they used to be, but this slide lists many of the reasons a memo might be used. And in particular, it's important to note that memos are internal communications. So they are used within a business or organization for one individual or department to communicate to another individual or department or, the employees generally. So it wouldn't go outside. That would be a letter that would be used for that. But some of the reasons we might see memos used would include things such as conveying another document. That's a memo of transmittal. So you want to send a manual to someone, and you write up a memo and you paperclip it to the top of the manual, and you put it in the interoffice mail, and it goes to that person. Maybe there's a memo of announcement. So you might see that posted in a break room or at the area where workers might be clocking in, and it might announce, things that are going on in the company. Oh, the parking lot's being repaved, so you'll have to park somewhere else. That sort of function. And memos are often used for summary or follow-up situations. So for example, perhaps there's a meeting people have attended, they've had discussion about something, they've reached some decisions, and afterwards someone goes home or goes back to their office and types up a memo that revisits the outcome of the meeting and maybe reminds people what they need to do before the next meeting. So it can serve as a record for the people who were there, or also for the people who were unable to attend that meeting as well. Now, some of these features are also accomplished via email, and email and memo, as you'll find, do share a lot of commonalities. There are certain physical elements required for a memo to be considered usable. First, at the top of the page, you're going to have memorandum or memo or interoffice communication or something along those lines. That will be followed by the 4-line heading section. The sender's initials will be written to the right or typed to the right of the sender's name. And then there's the overall body text of the memo. That's the information that the memo is trying to convey. The memo heading section includes 4 elements. First is the to line that gives the recipient's name and their organizational title, followed by the from line, which has the sender's name and organizational title, and to the right of the sender's name, the sender's initials, handwritten or perhaps typed using a different font, and that's the equivalent of a signature that you might see at the bottom of a letter. The third line is the date line, and the month does need to be spelled out, so don't purely use numerals. It's okay if you do that US style with the month followed by the date, or international style where the date precedes the month. Either way is perfectly okay. And then you need a subject line, and that information should be expressed as specifically as possible to help the reader understand how your memo should be acted upon. Okay, so here we see the word memorandum at the top. We have the to line, the from line. Notice the sender has initialed to the right of her name. There is the date line, and then there is the subject line. And you'll see how this subject line is relatively specific. It's not just sales data, because we would wonder, well, what about the sales data? So we know here, we know which sales data. We need the September sales data. We know that it's needed, so that's what about it. And the sender's also put a date in there that lets me know when I need to act by. So having that subject line really helps the person know what the memo is about and to act on it. So try to encapsulate what the memo's main point is in that subject line. And the other thing to notice here is about formatting, how this heading part of the memo is left justified, but in effect it's like 2 columns. So the to, from, date, and subject part are all left justified at the left margin. But then the things that fill in those fields are also left justified, but just a tab over. So it looks kind of like two columns. You don't do it by making columns, you just do it by hitting the tab key after the words to, from, date, and subject to get it to line up neatly. Now memos can contain optional elements as well, and section headings is one actually that I recommend that many memos should use. Strictly speaking, they are optional, but they do add usability to memos because they help the writer of the memo to organize his or her information, and they help the reader of the memo to access information quickly and readily. You don't necessarily need to use standard section headings like summary, discussion, and recommendations, although sometimes those are appropriate. You can create your own section headings that are pertinent to your memo. Just use those to sort of organize the memo's information. Enclosure notations are used when your memo is conveying another document. Distribution notations are like the copy line in a letter or a CC line in an email when your document's going to multiple audiences. And some memos might use graphic highlights if it's relevant, although as I say, that is definitely optional and probably isn't going to be relevant for anything you might create for this class. Now for some memo writing tips. Firstly, a memo does not use a salutation. That is the Dear So-and-so line in a letter. Because a memo has a to-line right in the heading section at the top, you do not need any kind of greeting or salutation in the body of the memo itself. A memo usually will benefit from using boldface section headings to help organize the document. And a memo definitely benefits from being concise. Most memos are going to be well under one page, and certain features such as bullet point lists can make your discussion even more concise and accessible. And a memo should not include a complimentary closing, signature, or type name at the bottom. That's something we would see in the letter as sincerely, and then your signed name, and then your typed name. In a memo, there is a from line at the top of the memo in the heading section, and that encompasses that information. So don't include that information at the bottom of your memo. When writing a memo, just remember that because they are inter-office communications, they're going to people whom we continue to work with. So it's important to remember that the person you send this memo to will see you the next day, or maybe at some point in the future in the workplace. Memos are concise, they're usually very direct. Try not to get into overly formal sounding writing. So you do want to have a professional tone, but you don't want to have a stuffy tone. You don't want to use letterese. You do want to organize your documents appropriately and use a subject line that will help the reader to do what he or she needs to do with this memo. And think about who the memo needs to go to. A lot of times in a workplace setting, a memo may need to go to everybody, but sometimes it just needs to go to one person. And sometimes the right way to send the information is a paper memo, but increasingly, of course, that's going to be email. And as I said, email will be the next lesson in this class, the lecture 6, but there are a lot of commonalities between emails and memos, so there's some overlap in these concepts. Document design is a whole different concept, so we're shifting gears here. Document design's really talking about the look of the physical look of a document, but it's not just an aesthetic consideration. Document design also helps readers to access information, so it's not just artsy, bells and whistles. It's really a vital way to convey information. The document design, as I said, is not just about aesthetics, although that is a little part of it. We want our documents to be inviting, to look good to the reader, but it's really mostly about usability. It's about helping the reader find the information he or she needs, about helping the reader understand that information readily and do whatever he or she needs to do with that information. So choosing a design or creating a design that meets existing expectations of your audience is really helpful. Certain genres of document tend to have a certain physical form, and readers will expect that. And if you violate those expectations, you will often make it harder for the reader to find the information and to use it. Now that doesn't mean that you cannot be creative or or do things that are maybe new or breaking new ground, there is a place for that. But you have to have a purpose for that, and what you choose has to facilitate the audience's goals and the audience's use of the document. Now, when we're talking about document design, I'm going to point you to some really good illustrations in the textbook. So on pages 284 and 285 in the textbook, you'll see an example of some information about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, from the Centers for Disease Control. And these two facing pages present the exact same information, but they are presented in a very different way. The left-hand page is hard to read. It looks like one big wall of text. You can't differentiate any particular topics to find specific information, such as maybe what COPD is. You'd probably have to start reading at the beginning and just keep reading until you found it. But the document on the right-hand page isn't just more appealing visually. It doesn't just sort of look nicer. It's easier to use. It has section headings, so if I want to know what COPD is, I can look at the heading that says what is it. I can find that information immediately. I get in, get out. Because there's more white space on the page, that information looks less intimidating. It looks like there's less information, even though it's the exact same words as the document on the right-hand side of the page. The use of color helps make the document more attractive. It also makes it look more official. It's got a nice header and footer that obviously belong to this official government agency, and the document looks more legit, as the saying goes. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about document design. To create a design that's going to be effective for your readers, begin with the general layout of your document. Think about what the typical expectations are for the genre of document that you're creating. Is it going to be more effective to use a horizontal grid, or might columns, a vertical grid, be useful in this document? So you've got to think about how the information is related, how the user's going to use the document physically, and what this document will help the reader to do. And choose the physical layout that's going to sort of facilitate that. You're also going to want to choose an overall design in terms of typeface and in terms of things like color or any graphical features. You want a consistency because that's going to look professional. We saw that in the revised CDC flyer, where the consistent use of particular typeface, of boldface for the headings, of color in the header and footer made for a very professional document. It makes your document look more legitimate. Also, we saw in that CDC document how headings really helped the information to be located much more readily than the original document. So you'll want to think of headings that will help your reader locate information quickly. Just be careful not to overdo it, because if you have too many headings, they lose impact. So you do still need to group your information into categories and create headings to reflect those categories. Other ways to create a design that is workable for readers include making sure that there is adequate white space in the document. So white space are the places that don't have words or images, and that sort of negative space helps to emphasize elements of text that you might want to emphasize. It helps to group related ideas, and really the more complex the information you're presenting, the more white space your document needs to use to sort of provide places for the brain and the eye to rest. Margins are a form of white space as well, but they also serve a practical purpose, allowing room for the reader to hold the document in his or her hands and to allow space for binding. And elements like vertical lists, they might be bullet point or numbered list, are another way to group and organize information, and they really facilitate accessibility. Memos in particular lend themselves to using lists of information. Just make sure that items in a list are always grammatically parallel. So for example, maybe everything in a list is all a noun. It's a list of supplies a person has to have. Or maybe the listed items are all complete sentences. Or maybe they're all verb phrases. So just have a particular consistency. That kind of predictability helps the reader to understand and interpret the information. Using the same kind of typeface throughout the document, as I said before, gives a consistency to the document that looks professional and helps the reader to consider your document is representative of your organization. Design features like boldface, italics, underlining, and color can be really useful to highlight elements in documents, especially using them as headings or to stress important pieces of information. Use of color we talked about within instructions to highlight things that are warnings or cautions, for example. But you don't want to overdo it. When you have too many of these kinds of design features, they lose meaning. So use them sparingly. And make sure that your headings are well chosen and are descriptive of the information you're conveying so that they are helpful to your readers. So this week, as we've said before, Project 6 is the assignment due. It is discussed in some detail in the first video, so if you have not watched that, you'll want to be sure to do that before you complete this assignment. You'll probably also want to take a look at the sample instructions analysis memo that is in the sample documents folder here in Blackboard Learn. In a previous semester, another student did a version of this assignment that I edited and posted as a sample for students to see. It has all three parts of the requirements for Project 6. It has the original instructions that the student is going to critique. It has the memo of analysis, and it has the revised instructions where the student has tried to improve on them. And I'll mention that the instructions that students submitted were probably a little bit longer than the typical instructions I get for this assignment. So don't feel like yours have to be quite so long, but that's okay. And remember, if you have any questions about Project 6, please post them to the questions discussion forum in Blackboard Learn as early in the week as possible. Now for next week, we again have two chapters. Chapter 14 will be focusing on email, and Chapter 17 will be focusing on technical definitions. And you might divine from those two chapters what your work on Project 7 will involve, but we'll talk more about that next week. Catch you later.